So welcome everyone to this, which is our third portion, I guess you could say, or third part of our reading, what we call our Reading Forum series with Joe Gunn and his book, Journeys to Justice, Reflections on Canadian Christian Activism, which is from 2018, but still in print and still relevant. So, but before we begin, just begin with a land acknowledgement, just to be mindful of the land upon which we reside and its history. And just acknowledge that that the Jesuit Forum is located on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. And the Forum acknowledges that Toronto, known as traditionally, is governed through Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as someone who has personally lived on this land for many years, since I moved from Sault Ste. Marie to study at the University of Toronto, I'm deeply grateful to experience the natural beauty and resources of this land. It's many beautiful ravines that I walk in a lot on the shore of beautiful Lake Ontario, and a place known and respected for its cherished tree canopy. This land has provided me personally with a place to live, study, and work that I'm grateful for. And I recognize that this privilege comes from the stewardship and care of the Indigenous peoples who have lived here before me for millennia. And I remain committed to learning more about the rich histories and diverse cultures of the Indigenous communities of this region. Their resilience, traditions, and contributions continue to inspire and educate me. And in my personal life and vocation as a Jesuit priest in Toronto and representative of the Jesuit Forum and Regis College at the University of Toronto, I strive to support reconciliation efforts by actively participating in community events, supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, and educating myself, continuing to educate myself and others about the ongoing impacts of colonization, particularly through Jesuit forums and in my capacity as a teacher. And I pledge to respect and honor this land and its first inhabitants, acknowledging their enduring presence and contributions to our collective future. And so I invite you to take a moment in the chat to acknowledge the land upon which you are privileged to call home. You are grateful to call home. So just say a little word about kind of our reading forums. We thought at the forum that it would be nice to, often we have forums on specific issues within, and then we break up into small groups with a guest presenter. But we also thought it would be nice just to kind of have a commonly known as a book club series, but we call them reading forums instead of book clubs. And just a way to kind of share with one another through some initial input the good things out there that are a pleasure to read and to learn from under our mission. The thoughts in book form of works on social justice, social awareness in Canadian society in particular, but not just limited to Canadian society. And one of these books, just really going through my bookshelf, it's a way to kind of share books on my bookshelf, Journeys to Justice, that Joe Gunn wrote a few years ago, and its relevance today. And just a word about it, Journeys to Justice is described as a long view of social change in Canada and the good that church leaders have accomplished in social works, from influencing the development of Canada's healthcare system, to our great welcoming of newcomers in Canada, and the role that church leaders have played in this this tradition to be proud of in Canada, the social tradition to be proud of in Canada. And Joe once said that deep social changes take a long and dedicated time in coming. A way to stay faithful to the best of Canadian traditions and work together on these big Christian concerns. In his time with Citizens for Public Justice, he said that it helped move the ball forward with relatively small successes. For example, which he mentioned in an interview, in trying to get the Canadian government to end travel loans for refugees. That was the goal. But instead, settling for the a kind of smaller success, I don't know if that's the way to put it, and getting it to just to drop the interest charges on the loans. And in his partnership with anti-poverty organizations on urging the government to adopt a national anti-poverty reduction plan, he said, "It's an effort that took a decade of hard work. We rarely see the massive breakthrough that people want to see. But we start with building hope and ways for people to move forward." So it's just kind of shows me that the work of people in social action, Christian social action, it takes patience and faith, that there are no overnight successes, and we don't always achieve what we ideally envision in our work and our striving for social justice. But the hard, patient, faith-based work that it entails, is very, it makes it even more inspiring and uplifting. So just before I just want to give a little background on Joe before I hand it over to him. Joe grew up in a working class family in Scarborough. His father and uncles were blue collar workers, factory workers, many of them, and he himself worked in a factory when he was young. And in the 70s, he became involved in the Catholic youth movement, joined the youth core movement of the Toronto Diocese. And during, when he was young, he recalled visiting a camp in the jungles of Mexico, refugee camp that he visited that hadn't been connected with the United Nations. And he had 3 children he was trying to fly out to receive medical attention, and one died in his arms. This is from an interview I read, Joe reflecting on his life and social justice work. He said it was horrible, but the experience helped him realize that the workers in these refugee camps were the people doing the most incredible, selfless work. What you found was faith in action, he said. The church was a place where you could put your most cherished values and try to live them out in an organized way, and in a way that would have impact. And then for later on, as he was growing, for a number of years, he worked in Central American refugee camps, development projects in Nicaragua. And then he came back to Canada, where he served as the chair of the Interchurch Community on Human Rights in Latin America. And then for a number of years, he worked with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he served as chair of the Aboriginal Rights Coalition and liaison to several other ecumenical justice coalitions that preceded the creation of Kairos. And then Joe served as the founding vice chair of Kairos Canada, which still exists today. And then he joined Citizens for Public Justice as executive director in 2008. And then in February, an ecumenical social justice work. And then in February 2019, he became the director of the Central Oblat in Ottawa. And I'll just say, before I say a couple of honors, in 2012, Joe was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for exemplary service and commitment to the betterment of the community. And in 2013, he was awarded the Certificate of Honor from Development and Peace for commitment to the cause of social justice and efforts to improve living conditions for the poorest of the poor in the Global South. And then St. Paul University granted Joe the Eugene de Maisonneuve Medal in 2017, honoring individuals who have made a significant contribution to the development of human capital in their community. And I just wanted to go in a little more detail with Joe's background, because though Joe was the writer of this book, he himself could be in this book as well. So, but yeah, I just want to say that Joe is not merely an author, but he is a significant contributor to the social justice work in Canada and in the world. So we're very glad to have you, Joe, with us and sharing your wisdom and in the stories of the people you've met in your storied career. So far, it's not over, but so far. So, welcome, Joe. I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Trevor. That was a dangerous series of comments because there are many people here that would just love to set the story straight, but glad to see so many faces that I know, and thank you for this chance to start off a conversation this evening. The first thing I have to say is because Sherilyn Sparkman's on this call, and she was for a long time the chair of CPJ. The book was kind of a fundraiser for CPJ, and if you haven't seen it or if you want a copy for a friend, apparently CPJ has a box of 40 books left, and they're offering them at $20, including postage, which is apparently a little bit better than you can get if you buy them from Novalis. We also should support Novalis, but anyway, there is I'll just put an email in the chat to order them if anybody wants to get a copy of the book. You can get that deal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about why we did and then what's in the book. I'll share some photos of rogues galleries, and you can raise your hand or smile or throw a tomato at the screen if you recognize some of the rascals that were involved. The basic thing to understand is when you're not smart enough to write your own book, what you do is you interview other people. And that's exactly what I did. There are 10 stories in the book and most of them told the truth. I mean, there's a few I cut out, but most of them told the truth of certain times when people working in social justice, ecological justice in the churches move the yardsticks forward. There are many, many stories, and many, many people deserve to be recognized, of course, for work over the years. What I tried to do is pick some of the moments that showed that for another generation of people, you could, if you wanted to work and move the yardsticks forward on social and economic justice, ecological justice, you could do that through the churches. Because unfortunately, as we know, large groups in society, there are studies that are done. I remember reading them from the University of Toronto and others that our communities are becoming less and less acknowledged as places where progressive care for care we do well, advocacy, changing the yardsticks on policy, that maybe not so much. And I was reading the chapter documents of a religious order of men recently, and they actually said our church is perceived as a self-marginalizing institution, often entrenched in moral or doctrinal issues about abortion and sexual morality, a church that is not open to people's experiences. This was a group of Catholics, but I wonder if some of our friends in other Christian communities don't feel the same. So if you look at the Bible, and Habakkuk in the second chapter talks about writing down the vision, remembering the stories, the history, reflecting on them, connecting to what's going on today, and then deepening the learnings. That's what we were trying to get at. And frankly, I think, I wouldn't have to convince anybody on this with us this evening, but we do have to make a convincing case that you can deepen spirituality by getting more actively involved and engaged in the struggles for justice and the transformation of the world. Not everybody in our communities seems to really believe that. And so, so what I did was I wanted to refer to those kinds of people that had made a little bit of a difference. So just for fun, I'm going to put up some slides and quickly show you the Rogues Gallery. See if this works here. So if you can see the fellow on your left on the screen, John Foster. John Foster was a fellow that was working, he's still with us, he's here in Ottawa, well into his 80s. I saw him 10 days ago. John was working in the United Church and was one of a group of people in the churches that really went to bat when in 1973, the coup of very, very right-wing generals took over in Chile and worked people like Francois Lapierre, who later became a bishop, and George Graham from the Anglican Church, Buddy Smith from Scarborough Missions. They all went off to Chile, forced the government to open the doors to Chilean refugees to come to Canada, saved many, many lives, including the life of a man who was brought to Canada from Chile and became brother-in-law to me. My first nephew has the name of this fellow's best friend who was tortured and killed by the military in Valparaiso in Chile. So some of these stories intersect with our lives at certain times. Anyway, this is a picture of John receiving an award. Now we have someone on our esteemed person on our call, Bob Thompson, who actually also received an award. There's a story about Bob releasing the cables from the Canadian ambassador to Chile. This was Ambassador Ross was off in Argentina buying a vehicle when the coup took place in Chile, but really wasn't interested in helping the scum of the Latin American left or saving any of these lives. And the churches worked against this, and there's a wonderful series of stories of what John did. And just last year, the 50th anniversary of the coup, he did a book telling many of these stories. Again, Novalis published it, and Bob and John received yet another medal last year on the 50th anniversary from the Chilean ambassador. So an amazing moment when the churches together move those yardsticks forward. I don't know if people would remember Moira Hutchison, another United Church person whose husband taught for many, many years at theology at the University of Toronto. Moira, here's a story. I wanted to talk about how the churches really moved to end the situation of apartheid in South Africa, how the investments of Canadian firms were called into question, and amazing work that was done. I wanted to interview Renata Pratt, whose husband, Cranford Pratt, also taught at the University of Toronto. And Renata, by the time I was able to get to her, had, through old age and so on, had suffered, and we weren't able to do that. But Moira worked with her a lot. And here's a story that really, really, I think the Canadian churches work on corporate social responsibility, getting the Canadian government under Brian Mulroney to stiffen their spine. He's often congratulated for that work, but work was done for years and years to get the churches working on and the Canadian government to take on the apartheid regime. So that's the story that Moira tells. On Olthius, there's a character. This is a Christian Reform fella from Edmonton, worked at the precursor of Citizens for Public Justice. In the mid-70s now, this is the Berger Inquiry, and the Catholic Bishops of Canada wrote Northern Development at What Cost. And John was key in fighting the National Energy Board and the fight on the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. If there was a young person today that was coming out for Fridays for the Future, or the thousands of people that are concerned about climate change, if they knew that at one time the churches actually funded, between the Anglicans and the Catholics, $100,000 to the Brotherhood, the Indian Brotherhood of the Northwest Territories, to hold their meetings to look at whether they wanted a pipeline or not, and what it would mean for them, a loan that was paid back. Or if they knew that there was a Catholic bishop that opposed, they called into, you said the tar sands in Alberta, a moral problem. You know, these are important stories, and how it's not new that the churches are beginning to develop the work in this area, but there was a time when it was much more, let's say, frontal in terms of taking on these kind of policies, and people like John even taking this forward to in the court system. Bill Jansen, still with us as well. I was at his church a couple of weeks ago talking about the Jubilee campaign we're involved in now. He's a Mennonite fellow, and Bill was the signatory with the federal government for the first agreement that would allow groups of individuals and churches eventually to sponsor refugees to come to Canada. There's a wonderful story there. There's lots of the work that lots of parishes do and groups do, but we actually used to do advocacy as well to change government policy and to create new possibilities in this work. So Bill is still with us and has won the Order of Canada a couple of years ago for that particular role, I think, among others, with Mennonite Central Committee. Marie Zeroni. Now, Marie Zeroni is a sister in British Columbia. Now I did mention this as a rogues gallery, but there's several rogues on your screen as well. John Malloy is one of them. I think he was a cabinet minister in the Marxist-Leninist government of Ontario, wasn't he? A previous Liberal government in Ontario. But John teaches a course at Waterloo Luther College, and he offers to students to take a look at the book and then choose one of the issues that they want to take forward. And much to our surprise, a few years ago, most of the students, there's 10, so students can choose one area. Quite a few of them were choosing Marie's story. Why was that? How is it that they would settle on that? What Marie did was she decided to go and work in the Northwest Territories with, I want to say there's about a half dozen bishops in different dioceses that are spread out all over the North. And they ended up, I'm sure she wrote, they decided to work on the issue of conjugal violence against women. I have to this day not heard in a Catholic church a sermon on violence against women. But Marie was able to get the bishops to release not one, not two, but three of these documents, and then travel throughout the North, workshopping this, working with different social agencies, with communities, mining towns, Indigenous communities, and so on, and facing this issue. And I think John's experience, if I'm correct, in when you offer the students some of these examples of issues to look back on, you say, wow, this was one that was of interest to quite a few people. Fabien Leboeuf was a wonderful, wonderful leader at Development and Peace in Montreal, the Catholic Aid Agency. So some of the issues that I chose, people moving the yardsticks forward, as they said, were people that worked ecumenically, and Fabien did that. He was on the first board of Kairos when we created it, but he was also a guy that pushed Le Marche des Femmes for the year 2000, when we looked at the question of women's rights in the church. And he suffered a lot for that. There was huge pushback. I was at the CCCB at the time. We were able to get the CCCB, Development and Peace, and the CRC, the Religious Congregations in Canada, to support the Marche des Femmes. And this was a moving time. I remember being in the cathedral in Ottawa, where there was mass by the Archbishop with the sisters in the front, and then they all processed out and joined the march that was going from across the Quebec side, across the bridge into Parliament. And I mentioned I was there with my family, and somehow I remember just breaking down and crying that we had finally done this, because there was so much pushback from people that said Catholics can't work with women's organizations because some of them support abortion. And Fabien tells the story of back and forth and how really this particular church really needs to work on these issues in ways that were wonderful and important, and how we can be allies, and how we have to move through the politics of these situations. So Fabien has now passed away, he and his wife, Lucy, just a couple of years ago. Great fella. And here's one of my best pals who just, well, 2 weeks ago, we had the commemoration of his life. Some of you will recognize Tony Clark. He worked 21 years at the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops as their social justice guy. And Tony was well known for, I mean, when I was working in the West, we'd get these Labor Day statements from the bishops, and we'd travel around into cold basements of prairie towns and talk about this and this and the other thing. When Tony was working at the CCCB, something like 10% of the social teaching from around the world was coming out of the Canadian bishops. They were known for this. And the famous the last day of 1982 statement on the Canadian economy that drove Pierre Trudeau to a frenzy and telling the bishops got it wrong and so on. Tony was the author of that. I was way in Latin America at the time, and I told the story at the commemoration of Tony's life with about 150 people there. What was it? No, last weekend, the weekend before, 2 weekends ago. Yeah, that I'm in Latin America, and I get a note from a fellow who wasn't a Catholic saying, "My God," he said, "the bishops. I've seen this letter. The bishops are all over the news. They're to the left of the NDP." I thought, oh, some things in Canada have changed. But anyway, Tony was quite a wonderful guy, and he tells the story of how this the end of 1982 letter took place and so on. And Tony's book, Behind the Mitre, which came out in 1995, I think it was like a purging of him. I went to work at the CCCB 7 months after Tony had really been dismissed. And we were pals. He'd shared with me the outline of the book long before it was published and so on. I kind of knew what I was getting into, but I really got beaten up when I traveled around because people thought Tony was quite wonderful, the kinds of groups that we would meet with, and yet he'd been kind of summarily, it was his time, and they kind of pushed him out of the way. He went on to set up the Polaris Institute and other things. But the fact that a letter of the Catholic bishops could be and social teaching of the Canadian bishops could be front page news for weeks and translated into many languages and shared around. This is a story worth telling. Now, I think let me just babble on one little bit more about that. These stories there are others. I mean, I didn't show all 10 of them. But these stories were told all at a time when we had all these coalitions. It was pre-Kairos. Kairos came about in 2001, as Trevor and Maura and others have said. You've served on the board of Kairos. So what we see today, though, is, of course, as of 2016, the Catholic bishops decided to abandon this ecumenical work. And we have to call a spade a spade. I mean, it shows. So when we have the pilgrimage to Ottawa, or for the last 2 years, faith leaders, Christian faith leaders have come to Ottawa. The pilgrimage that goes to the Hill twice in those 2 years, they've met with the government people and so on. These are all the churches of the Christian persuasions. No Catholic bishop will participate on those things, at least formally. We've got a couple of guys that participated in events. I know of two in their own diocese. So this leadership vacuum, Tony referred to it in his book in 1995, Behind the Miters. I said, but we're really in a different time. And I think for those of you that may be Catholics, and maybe not all of us are, but to note that before this month of May, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, the famous encyclical of Pope Francis on environmental justice and so on. Very few people, maybe Monica Lambton would know, but very few other people know or have read that the bishops of Canada wrote 3 pastoral letters before Laudato Si even came out, and that Laudato Si actually quotes the 2003 letter of the Catholic Bishops of Canada in section 85. So that tradition and that history was worthwhile. It could have been used better, but we've kind of fallen by the wayside. So the last piece I'll say about the book itself is that there are of course gaps. I chose these 10 stories, but you know what? It was hard to find women because not all of there weren't many women that were hired in these positions, the ecumenical positions and in the church positions. And so I wanted 2 younger women to reflect on what this could mean for today. So Leah Watkis, who works for the Joes as Sister St. Joseph in Toronto, still there, did a wonderful job there. And there's a United Church woman here, Christine Boyle, who at the time started a group called Fossil Free Faith. And when she wrote a little essay for the book, or a little reflection from the book, Christine said she was actually just finishing her last steps, and she's an ordained minister now in the United Church. Then she got elected to city council, and now she's a member of the legislature in British Columbia. Anyway, and I'll end with 2 of my favorite quotes from Christine's part of the book. She says in her reflection, "The Church of Christendom was a colonizing and, as my peers might say, mansplaining church. It participated in cultural and human genocide, wiping out rich ways of knowing and practicing faith in God. It assumed it knew better than everyone else, creating strict hierarchies and embedding competition, isolation, and secrecy into each level. It lost my generation, not because the music was too quiet, but because the hypocrisy was too loud." So at times I got accused of telling all the good stories or trying to highlight the good stories, but we do have shadow sides in the Christian tradition that Christine acknowledges. Then she goes on to say, it's true that our ancient stories bring a longer time frame to social movement work. It's also true that there are challenges that require us to move faster than our institutions are designed to move. I wrestle with this tension, says Christine. Sometimes the church feels like a soothing balm for the parts of me that are on fire. And sometimes it feels like our whole building is on fire and we're standing inside singing dirge-like hymns. I think that kind of grabs some of the different feelings that people that are involved in social justice work or ecological justice work in the churches confront. What has to be true, and I'll end with this, is that you can work for change in society by being part of these movements in the church, and we have to strengthen them. But also, it is true and it is legitimate to work to change these churches. We need a new church if we're ever going to be able to build new societies and a new world. So Trevor, I'll kind of stop there if I may.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe. You'll stop for this portion of our time together. Thank you. You know, I really, when you're quoting Christine, I really feel, you could really feel the sense of her faith and everyone's faith that working for justice means that there are deficiencies in our society and also deficiencies in our faith. But despite the deficiencies, or through them, through the broken vessels of our faith and our society, that it's our inherent faith that keeps us going forward, and not abandoning our faith and not giving into cynicism. So you really feel the sense of everyone's faith in these stories. So thank you so much, Joe. So we're going to move into our any questions that people, any of you have for Joe. I have a number of them, but I will refrain, and I've spoken enough for now. So yes, if there's anything you would like to ask Joe, if there's a question you want to pick up on anything that he shared, please, if you could put up your digital hand or your regular hand. Pat.
I'm not sure how to say this in a politically correct way, so I'm not going to try. I remember all of those moments where the bishops, I mean, I've got the green book and the blue book of the Catholic social teachings, and I grew up with that as a foundation for my own desire to do justice. And I remember when the bishops wrote about the economy. I mean, I remember all of those moments that you were speaking about. I wonder what it would take to encourage the bishops to use their voice again. There's a vacuum. It's as loud and clear as a vacuum can be. And it makes me very sad because I know, like, even when I was studying in Toronto in the 90s, when I was at St. Michael's College in the summertime, and then when I was full-time, students would be like, they wouldn't speak their minds when we'd have conversation in our classes, our theology classes. And I kept thinking, what's wrong with these people? Like, they're all intelligent and they've got ideas. I'm sure they do. But why are they? And then one of them said to me, there might be someone here from the bishop's office who will report on us. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. That's ridiculous. The bishop, I mean, the bishop is a good person, I'm sure. I didn't know who the bishop was. I mean, I didn't know the Bishop of Toronto as much as the one from Sault Ste. Marie. But that the bishop would have that kind of power and fear, to me, it just didn't make sense. Maybe in Northern Ontario, we live differently than you do in Southern Ontario. I don't know. But I really pray that at some point our bishops will get inspired again. Joe, is there something you can suggest that we could encourage them, or some way to encourage them to be more vocal about Catholic social teaching, about the big picture? Sorry, just a little question.
Yeah, well, just a couple of comments quickly so we can move to, I mean, some ideas here. You know what? I think there's nothing wrong with continuing to let bishops who will listen know what we would like to see of them. I think, you know, we can do that in several ways as individuals sometimes, but you can also do it through organizations like the CRC or others, you know. I don't think we should just fill in the holes that they're no longer deciding to lead on. But you know, there are times when we can step up. On the other hand, there are times when, and I think a number of women in the church, including in my own family and even religious that I know, are saying it might not be worth it going to try and to change these fellows. And there, I think, well, we can work on other strategies. For example, I on the question of Gaza and the inability to participate in the pilgrimages and the statements of other church leaders coming and meeting with. I was so upset about this, but it turns out that there were 2 bishops that I found out who participated and signed on to the support of the Kairos work on Gaza and the pilgrimage and prayer and all this kind of stuff. I just decided I'd write. I didn't even know. I had not met either of them, but I wrote them a little note saying thank you. Didn't hear back from either of them, but I just decided that's one level. So I think, you know, keep at it, but also decide where we can play a role as lay people. Or, but I'm one of these fellows that doesn't really want to forgive that vacuum for existing, but try to think really smartly about what we can and can't do at a certain moment. Probably not all the answer you wanted, but maybe we should hear from others.
Thank you, Joe. Greg.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Joe. I'm so glad you mentioned Gaza. I have to say, you know, 18 months, and my heart is broken watching this. Canada's support of a genocide that's being live streamed. And, you know, I approached, we had a change of pastors in June, and I approached my pastor at Christmas time, and I said, you know, all through Advent, we haven't had a word about Gaza, you know, and this is, you know, a historic event that's happening, and it's going to be recorded, our silence on it. Now, Pope Francis has set an incredible example. From the time the genocide began, he's spoken out against it. And when I spoke to my pastor, he told me that he had been forbidden by the bishops. They'd forbidden them to speak on Gaza. The Archbishop of the diocese, I won't mention any names, but I was flabbergasted. And this fear of being labeled anti-Semitic, which is so easy to defend against if you are a person of integrity and you're saying you stand for human rights. This silence, I dare say, is going to be recorded of the bishops that have not spoken out, just like during the Holocaust, the bishops who refused to speak out. And I would just add, I belong to Pax Christi, and the bishop won't even meet with us. An auxiliary bishop did. And we just finished a Canadian election in which every mainstream political party in this country is promising to increase war spending from 2 to 5% of the Canadian GDP, which is going to have devastating ramifications for this country, including our greater participation in American wars of empire, which are coming down the pipe at us very, very rapidly, the way the United States is escalating. So Joe, I just, forgive me, it's a lot, I know, but I am so disillusioned with the leadership, lack of leadership, when we have a Pope who bravely called the parish in Gaza every single night and encouraged those people, and who stood up. Not only did he speak up for the Gazans, he also called the NATO proxy war exactly what it was. NATO expansion, which led to this provocation of Russia, which, again, our media, our political leaders lie to us constantly. And I look to the church for leadership, and thank God for Pope Francis, the Berrigan brothers, Father John Deere, Father Louis Vitale. They keep me in the Catholic Church because I know there are people there that care. Thank you.
Well, Greg, you've said it well, and thank you, I'm sure, on behalf of all of us there. If I could have added another, a couple of years ago when I was doing the little book, there were novellas that decided to do it, and there were so many pages, but there's a great story from about 2003, I guess, when the churches organized a huge letter writing campaign into Ottawa around the Iraq War, and Jean Chrétien came out of I think, if I'm not mistaken, now here's the story. We have Project Plowshares, and Ernie Regier got the Order of Canada, and so on and so on. That's a group that didn't become part of Kairos, but is still active in Waterloo. And the story there was, I think it was Cardinal Carter or Cardinal Ambrosic, one of the funeral of somebody. He was at some event, and the evangelical Lutheran bishop from Eastern Canada was coming upstairs and saw the Prime Minister, introduced himself and thanked him for being there, and thanked him for not going in to send Canadian troops in. And Jean Chrétien said at the time, I couldn't have done it without all of the letters that I was receiving from the Christian community. So you gave me the permission, you gave me the support to be able to do that. So there are those kinds of stories where we need to have a voice together, right? That you so accurately talked about. And we need to kind of hold those up because, as you say, at a time like this, it just seems very, very dark and hopeless. So, yeah, keep at it with Pax Christi.
Thank you, Joe.
Peter.
Good to see you, Joe, and thanks. Good to be with everyone. I wanna continue with Pat's question, and in your response, I'm thinking towards the future and what our strategies can be. And you said something about not filling holes that the bishops had left. I'd like to hear you say more about that. But in general, I'd like your reflections about like what you've seen in the past, especially the Catholic bishops dropping the ball in social justice. What should we learn from that in how we go forward, especially for religious orders?
Yeah. So this is that could be a whole evening conversation. We'd have a really good time, Peter, going over that. I think there, I'm caught in this world of being, how can I say, way back in 2015-16, we actually had Catholic papers. I wrote monthly columns, and I gave the bishop shit over and over again for leaving Kairos, and a really good guy kind of countered in the Prairie Messenger and and but the debate wasn't taken up. I don't think they were getting mail or they were hearing about it. That was a real marker for me. People don't realize how important that since the 70s, participating in these ecumenical coalitions of justice really was. And Pat remembers the good days of Alex Carter and so on. They used to say, well, he was the good Carter because there were a couple of brothers that were bishops, right? But we don't get to name bishops too often. There are some stories around that too. But so what can you do there? Well, there has to be a staff complement. There have to be people there that have a history of social justice activity, that know what social struggle is all about. There has to be bishops named that are willing to move on some of these issues. And we all need training and research and going forward. I mean, can we name a social issue the bishops have really got involved in the last little while? It would be tough. I don't want to be downplaying that, but look for opportunities there. But then you have your question was, well, what can we do? The decision of religious congregations, Sue Wilson's on this call, is the chair of the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology. That's a brand new thing in the last 3 years. Peter, you know about that? We have 27 congregations have made contributions. There's a board of people that meet a couple of times a year, work on issues, especially related to environment, but we're hoping to make it a bigger thing. So some of the congregations are finding ways to go ahead and have impact, you know, and that doesn't mean that we don't work through the CRC or we don't work through other fora and so on, but maybe there's some new things happening from time to time that will you know, provide new, in this case, a kind of institutional support of those of us working together. At a certain age, we won't be able to go on and renew, hire some younger people, give people freedom to begin to work on some of these issues and open some doors. And to work with groups like Kairos and Citizens for Public Justice and some of the other, the Laudato Si movement and so on, which going, I see, I wrote a little piece for the Novalis book, was it last year? This business of, they were looking at the question of hope, and it's like social movements have to be, and there are Christian social movements as focal points for hope. None of us can take on these kinds of questions on our own. So what we find in these 10 little interviews with different people is some really wonderful people found a way to go forward, and we should be able to struggle and meet together and think through new creative ways to create new avenues for the next generation. But it will take the next generation. It won't be people that have no hair like me, or the little bit that's left is gray. But anyway, Sue, you probably have better ideas.
No, I'm not sure I have a better idea, but I do have a question for at least for the Catholics who are on this call. I don't understand why we keep using the bishops as the point of reference around justice in the Christian community when they have deliberately made themselves irrelevant to the whole conversation for decades. So, I mean, I think it's on us to kind of, you know, acknowledge that and to step into the void, you know, all of us as much as we can in as many different ways as we can. And, you know, if they should choose to make themselves relevant again at some point, celebrate that. But I just don't understand why we keep referring to the bishops in these conversations.
Yeah, that's a great place too. And I have this conversation quite often. See, my background is I worked 11 years for them, and my good friend Tony worked 21 years for them. And you keep hope alive, and maybe it's impossible. And I would say, you know, what some of us like me have to do is listen to women in the church. For those people that decide, many women in my family, some of whom have had roles with the church. I mean, I tell a little story of my own partner here at home. I mean, some of you probably done the blanket exercise, you know, on Ed Bianchi and Suzanne, my partner, started the blanket exercise around our kitchen table in the late. No, that could be another story. You know, it's much changed now. It's got Indigenous people have been writing it and working on it and so on. It's much better developed. But this is where it came from. My own partner doesn't really want to go to the Catholic Church anymore. She worries about the language you use. She worries about the governance structure. She worries about what she hears about women. She worries about some of the language in Genesis and so on and so on. It's a tough thing. And I think, Sue, you know, what I have to be careful about doing is not asking people to try and make themselves frustrated by dealing with a structure that won't change, but let's try to find those points where we can maybe have a bit of influence. The difference with me is, having been there, I don't want to let the guys off the hook, but I'm not having much success either. So anyway, Cheryl Lynn, you don't have to worry about the Catholic problem, probably.
Well, oh, can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. That's what I was going to say. I'm not Catholic, so I'm Lutheran. And I would just in answer to just a point that Sue made is that when the top representatives from the other from the other Christian churches in Canada, like the bishop in the Lutheran Church and, you know, the head of the Anglican Church and the head of the United Church, when they gather at a rally or they gather at an event in Ottawa, I think without having a bishop from the Catholic Church present too, it doesn't have the same kind of impact. That's what I would answer. You don't see them, they're not present.
And there's a lovely, well, lovely. What was it? Was it just last fall when the church leaders came to Ottawa and we did the pilgrimage downtown? There's kind of two stories about it. We in our parish, Suzanne had created these doves and put them on long sticks, and we took them down to protest the Iraq war, going into Iraq at the when we were supposed to have weapons of mass destruction, and we were going to do. Anyway, we do this in front of the U.S. Embassy. So those same peace doves and so on, they decided to bring them to our church, and so still to this day, you go round and round, the kids go round and round the altar before mass and so on. So it's a lovely kind of thing. It was a peace thing that's brought into the liturgy, from the street into the liturgy. Back out in the street we went again for the pilgrimage to the hill on Gaza. And all of us were carrying these same, I went to the church and got them all, we had these peace doves. And we told our daughter about this, who lives in BC now. And she said, oh, well, it's nice to know they're still being used, but really, are you guys still fighting that same fight? Like this is 20 years ago, that we do this. So it's a tough piece of work. But at that same event, where some of the church leaders spoke when we got up to the hill, there was no Roman Catholic bishop. And the Anglican bishop in Ottawa would not participate. But there was an Anglican bishop from Toronto. And in his talk, his few words, each of the leaders spoke before they went in to meet MPs. He quotes Pope Francis. And I thought, this is just, I just wish they get the message, that you've got other people quoting some of your leaders that are asking you to do this when you won't. And I don't know how to align these things, but little anecdotes sometimes give you a little bit of humor, if not a way forward. But Stan, don't let me go on and on.
Thank you so much, Joe. I have two questions. I don't know if I can combine them, but one is on what you said. Is the issues I was really struck when reading your book about the issues that are mentioned are the same as today. Consumerism and individualism and of course ecology. I was so struck by the migrants pipelines. It's exactly the same. So somehow it's a bit daunting because it means maybe we haven't made any progress. I mean, I guess these stories show so the contrary. There's impact that has been, but how to continue having an impact in a world that's completely changed? At the time of these stories, there was no internet. There was different bishops, as you just said, and so what was maybe the spark back in those days that we could kind of revive nowadays in a new context to still, tackle those same issues that keep coming, I would say. And then my second question is more about what you just said about listening to women. I was struck by Leah's contribution in the text, in the book, about, white men. I'm a white man, and I'm trying to have an impact, but somehow maybe we've taken too much room, too much space. So do you have any take on how should we listen better, maybe make room for others, maybe as you did in your book by showing other stories rather than yours? I don't know, but it's good to want to contribute, but we're always speaking too much, maybe wanting to solve things too fast. How to find that balance? If you have tips on that would be great too.
That's a great comments and so on. Too bad Leia's not here. We could take her name in vain. But some of the issues are the same, and yet if I was writing another volume, and I hope other people do write about this, you know, Rosemary Williams is, or one of the Williams is on this call. You know, John Williams wrote a book about some of the social statements that came out at a certain time. And then there was one other book about the coalitions and nothing else. Like we're not really good about telling our own stories. So that was another reason I wanted to do this. Some of the issues are the same, but there are some of them that are new, you know? So if we're looking at what someone would write something a few years from now about, you know, Elizabeth May gave me heck when we launched the book in Ottawa because I repeated a line I heard from Heather Eaton, you know, that the churches were late into the ecological station. No, they were not. She used to go to these meetings of the early meetings around environmental issues at the UN and so on. And David Holman from the United Church was there. David's still with us, I think. And, you know, so there were people that there are stories. The question of all these white folks, I was first involved 50 years ago on some, you know how we have these awful names, the Interchurch Project on Population. So Canada was developing a refugee policy. We didn't have a refugee policy in an immigration act. There was a green paper, and we just gave it heck. All the churches got together in this funny thing called ICPOP. And, you know, every single one of us was white. Back in, that would have been 73, 74, around the 73, 74. That's certainly not changed. Another problem, all of the churches were headquartered, except maybe the Lutherans that were in Waterloo and maybe the Mennonites that were in Winnipeg. They're all in Toronto, right? And there was a certain Toronto captivity of it, which was wonderful, and but we never met anywhere that wasn't on the subway line. You know, it wasn't on the TTC. It wasn't kind of done. And we certainly, you know, now when we reflect on, for example, the Jubilee campaign, because now we're 25 years later looking at the 2000 campaign. I could tell stories about that Jubilee campaign. Now we're in Jubilee 2025. And we held up Leviticus and the Jubilee Leviticus on LGBTQ issues is enough to turn people from coming anywhere near our churches, you know? So, and then the Indigenous question, I mean, we knew a little bit about this, but it has come to back to really be key. So there are new things we could and should reflect on and write about. Hopefully we'd have some success stories and some lessons and some other things that we could highlight and all of that. Those would be some of the new things that we could perhaps bring forward. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, I have a question. So Journeys to Justice is a story of individuals and through the organizations that they work through. But I wonder what your thought is around the potential dangers in focusing upon the strength and the charisma of individual activists. That we're focusing on individuals like in real time, not just in the past, but certain individual peoples like the nature of leadership, there's a lot of energy around them. And then when they pass on, their work passes on in so many ways. The energy dissipates. And I wonder the danger of that. Like I'm tremendously inspired by individual stories. I've many biographies, but I wonder, and we notice this in the Jesuits as well, you know, that individual Jesuits started works. I won't name any, but and that they had tremendous energy. But once they passed on, you know, if they involved a physical sort of manifestation, like a building, or like they became an albatross because there was no future leaders to pick it up with the same energy. So it was just these peaks. It's like, yeah, like our mission work is a story of peaks, sometimes very high peaks, and then it just deep valleys, and sometimes wide valleys. And I just wonder, is that cycle inevitable? Or is there a way that we can, while remaining inspired by individual Christian leadership, you know, also be mindful, like that it doesn't just rest on their shoulders for our longevity. I just wonder what you, yeah, it's a big question, I know, but
Yeah, but it's an important question. Thank you. I have a friend who says, we're so good at creating things and really, really good at putting them to bed when they no longer serve, and we've run into a little bit of that. Just to be a little naughty, I came back from Latin America, and there's the famous story of, I've been gone for 7 years. I had a new bride, and she had never lived in Canada before. We had to come to Toronto because that's where she was going to study. And I thought I was going to wash cars. And then I got this job offer from this guy, Cherney, to work for the Jesuits in the Jesuit Center for Social Faith and Justice, which met its demise and is now transformed and changed and so on and so on. So there are moments, and I guess I'll have to check. I guess some of the challenge for us is to be inspired by the individual stories. Here, I'm getting the sun coming in here. We can be inspired by the individual stories that we know of people and so on, and we should never read them as individual stories. None of us are, like behind the first chapter there about the bringing people out of the prisons in Chile and creating opportunities for people to come to Canada, and the fact that Bob Thompson was part of this call. There are many people played a role. I got John to tell the story because he's a historian and he's brilliant, and I knew that he would tell some of the details. But it was a story about thousands of people and thousands of families and all of that. So there are different, the Spirit gives different gifts. There are some of these amazing people, but there also have to be people that come and somehow create the possibility for a ministry to continue or not, because sometimes that's the case too. And sometimes it's that second, I don't know, group of people after the founder moves on. Religious congregations understand that. What happens when the charismatic founder passes on? Wow. That's an ongoing learning, isn't it? You don't want to over institutionalize something. You also don't want to lose some of the freedom and the charism and what do we need to protect? What do we need to let loose? These are good questions, and I would say one last thing that probably, I hope it doesn't sound trite, but at least in the Catholic Church, where we have now a bit of a short experience of synodality, we have to be present in that and push it and push it and push it, so that we get a sense of talking to each other and hearing from people in what we do. That might be at least one avenue to create some things in maybe ways we haven't fully experienced before. So the synodality, for those of you that don't know about that, is that a process that Pope Francis really started in 2021. There have been two, and then before he died from his hospital bed, he's written how this is going to go on up until 2028 of conversations in the Spirit, which is I think it's a Jesuit experience, right? Really, that people will actually, it's a way of bringing the church into more inclusion and what's gone forward. I think we could learn from religious congregations that have done this for a long time, and other Christian churches that have much more democratic governance structures than the Catholic Church, to be sure. But Bob, don't let me go.
Yes, I've just posted in the chat a brief comment, not that brief, I guess it's a paragraph, takes up the whole screen. Last year I ran across this book, We Can Change the World, which came out of the United States, Colorado. It's Tales from a Generation's Quest for Peace and Justice. It's much like Joe's book, Journeys to Justice, which I got a copy of back, when was it, not 2018 it was published? And what he's done is, he, as Joe has done, gathered stories of people who've done things in social justice areas to promote good things, but also to fight evil things. And I had thought, I wondered maybe if something like this might happen in Canada. And a couple of us have been talking about this, and just think we've sort of come to the conclusion that a book might not be the actual best venue for it, but a website might be. And so setting up Canadians Can Change the World and gather stories, as Joe has just mentioned, stories that will show people have done things, that there are all kinds of possible things not only to do, but success stories, as an example from this generation to the next generation, to encourage them to carry on and deal with all the new issues that are coming up all the time. And there's a review of the book. I put a link to it on the chat. And I'm hoping to be in touch with people soon. I have a list of about 45 different Canadian NGOs that are doing things, many of whom will be at Francis Harbour's memorial get together on Friday of this week, and I hope we may be able to talk about where we might go in that regard, not only with respect to churches, but with many other social justice organizations in Canada.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning. Francis Harbour was, for many years, the executive director of what was called the Interchurch Committee on Human Rights in Latin America, and just passed away recently. So that's, yeah, her funeral at the end of this week here in Ottawa, yeah. And thanks for posting that, Bob. We'll take a peek at it, because those are the kinds of resources that will really help us, I think.
Joe, maybe just in looking forward, just kind of in general, how hopeful are you in the future and keeping the spirit and the energy of Christian activism alive in Canada, you know, with new generations? Or did you merely write about sort of a golden age of Christian activism? But like, do you see, how do you see the future?
You know, this lovely United Church minister interviewed me in what used to be called the United Church Observer around this thing, and she said, "Your book reads like a lament." And so, oh God, you know, so do I really sound that old? And I think there, you know, what we have to do is realize that, you know, lamenting, there's a place for it. There's books of lamentations that we're aware of, and it's not whining, you know, or crying into a void. It's kind of a cry to God, and we can open ourselves to the world's deep wounds and still find some kind of a sense of peace. This work will go forward if people like us that are listening this evening decide this is really the best way to live. This helps me give meaning in my life, you know. The word makes sense. My life can make sense in trying to follow my belief and value system by being active, and not just in service, but actually in advocacy and education, and trying to move the yardsticks forward in these impressive ways. So, if I always say, or I have said, that, maybe the social justice people are the most obnoxious gang in the parish, right? Because they're always complaining about things that, the last thing the pastor or the parish worker wants to hear is, you want another room, you want another this, you want me to mention this in this, the homily or whatever, the sad sack gang is falling upon us, Well, no, we have to bring a certain levity, enjoyment, and we have to present these kinds of things as ways that people would want to get involved, and we have to enjoy each other, highlight each other, hold up each other, support each other. I think that's kind of the only way forward. Now, am I optimistic? I mean, I don't know about optimism in these kinds of things on some issues. I'm very, very optimistic. As Karen's left us, but I was telling Karen earlier on today, there was a right at the end of the Mass in my parish on Sunday, the priest said, well, there's a couple of people in the parish that have really taken on new and important roles, so we're going to invite them forward for the blessing. And so up comes Mark and Diana, and they get this lovely little blessing. And my big problem is, I don't know who spoke out of turn, but all the security detail kind of stands around me. The prime minister's over there, get away from me, kind of thing in our church, But there are some movements we didn't get 2 months ago what we might have got in a federal government. Maybe that's a sign of hope, but our work has to be deeper, and to see what we're going to happen in these days. The world has changed, as you said. So I can find small kind of things of hope, but you know what? Being around people that are really committed and that find their way through to deeper living is just what keeps me going.
Monica.
Yeah, thanks for this, Joe. It's really nice to be here with everybody and thinking back on these things. What you said about how social justice groups are seen in the parishes, it made me think back to what what we were talking about before about the bishops, and someone had asked, I think Pat had asked, how can we get the bishops back involved? And I remember when we went to visit the Social Justice Commission, and we're asking them to speak more about Laudato Si, which is, like a very safe issue. And they told us point blank that they're not going to speak publicly on these issues. They don't know enough, and they're terrified they're going to be brought down. And it's not, I don't think it's an unreasonable fear. It's a harsh world out there now. But as you rightly point out, a lot of the earlier people, they took a lot of flack, Fabian, and other people, you have to be strong to do this. But it also reminded me, though, of since I'm out here on the West Coast now, I've been crossing paths with Naomi Klein a bit more, and she repeats over and over and over again about how we need to be kinder on the left, about how one of the biggest mistakes that we've made is we're attack each other from within, where we can be really cruel. We have these really high litmus tests. Do you belong? Do you not belong? If you don't belong, we're really good at exiling people and shaming people. So I'm just wondering, I have a question for you. Without pandering to the bishops, without getting kind of totally focused on them, like Sue was saying, we don't want to be there. But at the same time, it would be a huge help to have that kind of leadership. And I think they're rightly pulling back, and not rightly, but I think their reasons are not unreasonable. So how can we invite them to be more courageous? How can we invite them to have, a firmer position in a way that that can be successful? So that they feel like they have people supporting them. They feel like Jean Chrétien can speak out because the churches are behind them. Anyways, that was my question for you.
I I really don't have any inside info to think about how that could be done, because I think I'm kind of in that middle place. I mean, some people would say it's not worth it. I think structures are important. And I think when the bishops left Kairos, they left Kairos because Kairos has on the letterhead all the member churches and so on, and whatever a statement would be made or a position would be taken, it was because there's a decision made at the board of Kairos, and the bishops couldn't always win or disassociate themselves there. They, at around the same time, the late 90s, the Catholic Church, as opposed to the Catholic Bishops' Conference, as opposed to the Church in the United States, in the Church in the United States, they don't participate in the National Council of Churches. But there had been a history of working with the Canadian Council of Churches as an associate member. The bishops decide to be members towards the end of the 90s, and they create a situation in the the Council of Churches where there's a consensus model. Any one of the 25 church members that doesn't want a statement to go ahead says so, and it does not go ahead. The churches, the Catholic Church, the Catholic bishops are quite pleased to be the largest funder of the Council of Churches, but not of Kairos. So there are things we can do as individuals. We may be able to reach out to certain individual bishops, make ourselves known, but structures are also important. Structures are important. And I think, also we have no control, as I've said earlier, over the people that become bishops. So it's I guess there have to be several different strategies, but I think the question Sue raised is, how much do we invest in that? Why do we, if they've left the scene and they've decided to set things up this way, and they don't even know what the implications are, maybe. So I don't know if I have an answer. Peter, sorry.
Before we get on to Peter, maybe if I could just add my own.
Sure.
I think I see where Sue's coming from. It's too much emphasis on the bishops in many ways, like the Catholic Church. Like before I was a Jesuit, I didn't know much about bishops at all. It wasn't my world. I didn't even know the bishop of my diocese. But I think that the bishops do have a significant potential to renew the credibility of our church. When a bishop goes to a parish, he'll likely fill the parish. When a bishop speaks publicly, like in a public sense, he has influence for good or bad. It just comes with the territory, unfortunately, but it does come with the position. And yeah, I just think I think it's an important question, not to get overly focused on it, but I wonder, like, retelling the stories of bishops from the past and how they could be an inspiration for bishops in the present. Maybe I'm being naive, but I'm thinking Cardinal Leger or Alexander Carter or Rémy Deroux, and there are many others. Like, how can we be an influence on bishops to be more of an influence on the wider church? I think it's something that's worth considering, but not being so focused on it. There are many other influencers, but the bishops, we cannot we can't forget them. Yeah. Peter.
I get a lot of hope from religious. I like and feel encouraged by these new initiatives. ORCE, religious working together. ORCE is a really good example, and I think that's one of the very few examples of formal Christian lobbying in Ottawa, in Canada anyway. And at the level of the CRC, the JPIC folks are trying to get organized. So that's encouraging too. There's maybe not a waterfall of activity yet, but that I find that encouraging. Well, I think we all know bishops who are inclined to social justice, but they need help and they need encouragement. Yeah, that's true. I find the bishops too quiet, but like other leaders, they need support too. So any ways that we can encourage them and let them know what folks on the ground are thinking and feeling, it can encourage them. Oh, they're like other politicians too, you know.
Only they're not supposed to be politicians. They're supposed to be tireless cultivators of the gospel. Isn't that what the Jubilee prayer says? That's what we're all praying for us to become. Right back at you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sue?
Sue, yeah, you can go, Sue.
Yeah, so I guess just to kind of push this point a little bit further, you know, I think of Francis's line that he wanted the priests and the bishops to smell like the sheep. Well, you know, I think part of our task is to say, hey, here's what the sheep are doing. Here's where the sheep are getting smelly. Do come join us. But, you know, it's not about, you know, not about what they're doing, it's about what the sheep are doing.
Yeah, there's a wonderful thing to look at. You know, the Laudato Si movement in the last while wanted bishops to receive letters encouraging them to divest from fossil fuels, right? And it was interesting. Had a conversation with this amazingly wonderful, dynamic young woman who's leading this in the United States. And her question was, you know, we have 5 or 6 bishops that are prepared to do this. They're prepared to divest. They'd like to divest. They're questioning whether they should just do it. Some of them have. Or should they wait and do it together as a kind of a signal to the rest of the church? Or will that just create such a backlash? Because, as you know, the US hierarchy is even more difficult than maybe the Canadian one. Will that, and so the kind of the decision about whether you just do this or you take a public stance, or whether a few people doing it, or whether they should wait until they get 20 or 30. These are all strategic questions, you know, and we're grappling with a little bit of that now. The question in Canada was, there isn't a diocese that's publicly announced that they're divesting. So, but you know, I wonder what would happen if we had all of our families that had decided our portfolios would divest, and then we could move some institutions to divest. And you know, there are 8 or 9, are there not publicly we know that 8 or 9 congregations of religious that have divested, and there are others that haven't, and so on and so on. Like maybe the idea of this movement building is it has to happen another way. Maybe trying to get your bishop to do it without a whole ecosystem of people deciding this is the way to go, and hold them to account that way might be a more successful strategy. So that's what we have. Those are the kinds of things we have to think through. And you know, at a certain point, if a whole bunch of Catholic institutions were saying this, and dioceses weren't divesting, you'd hopefully have them feel very, very uncomfortable with that kind of behavior. So I know our parish, strange parish, it actually has a portfolio we divested. The Oblates, because it's an oblate parish, the Oblates divested. The university, an oblate university, St. Paul in Ottawa, St. Paul University divested. It took years for all these things to line up. The Archbishop of Ottawa hasn't divested. He hasn't even responded to my letters about it. But the administrator for the archdiocese took me out for beer to talk about it. So maybe a small victory. John. John, go ahead.
John. Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Well, even if by some miracle, the bishops were to take on social justice as an important part of their work, don't you think that on the basis of especially the clergy abuse record in the Canadian Church, the bishops cover up all that, the bankruptcies, the that's one thing, and also the way that they have skirted around the Indigenous issues too. Don't you think that the bishops no longer have any moral leadership credibility? So no matter what they say, whether it's reactive or whether it's progressive, nobody's going to listen to them.
It could very well be. And I think it would depend a lot on how they speak. I think the situation in the past of producing doctrinal statements, you have to do this to be a Catholic, that ain't going to fly on social issues, even if they tried. On kinds of speaking. But the antidote to that, John, is of course the Pope we just had. He took a different way of speaking, and people listened. I think people listened. At the same time as he wasn't really well known for being completely understanding the question of women, completely responding to the questions, even on the penitential pilgrimage he made here on Indigenous issues, and talking about, was it a genocide and not, and so on. People will want more on the question of cover up on some of the sexual abuse scandals. He did make some steps, but others would argue not far enough. Yeah, but the way that man brought things forward, I think, inspired many of us to some kind of a hope. And so would the Canadian bishop, they'll have to earn it, and speak in ways that maybe are not too comfortable for them. I'd like to hope that we could have the leadership that we need, I suppose, and maybe it's just a hope.
John, back to your book again, or Joe, back to your book again more specifically. Again, looking forward, if you were to ever have a second edition or a part 2 even, who would you, in the last few years, what other stories come to mind that you would like to include if you had more pages or a second part, and even specifically what Indigenous leaders within the church that come to mind? Not to put you on the spot there, but yeah.
Well, maybe there are a couple of things we've kind of mentioned tangentially. I think if we were able to get a certain number of Catholic institutions and so on to tell the story about divestment from fossil fuels, and I think there are a number of other Christian churches that have done that. That would be an impressive story to move forward on. To put our money where our mouth is always a challenge, but wouldn't that inspire some? Another thing I find, when we work together as churches around the question of now this is a longer story and I won't go on and on, but the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was passed by the UN. Canada originally opposed it, one of 4 countries in the world. Then we finally said we'd come around, and then there was a private member's bill from Romeo Saganash in Quebec, in northern Quebec, to have Canadian law line up with the UN declaration, and we'd have to look at a range of things to do it. That private member's bill passed by the House, didn't go forward because an election was called, and then it came back, and there was a coalition that Catholics were not part of. The churches were taking this forward, and the Catholics weren't part of it. But then the congregations got involved. Some of us knew about it and got involved. And, you know, one of the most amazing evenings that I can remember in the last couple of years was we had over 1,000 people on a call, a webinar, to hear the 3 commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the first time they said they got together since the release of the report in 2015, to tell people why they had that, why the basis of the TRC was moving forward the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Now, one of the other most amazing things, and maybe I'll just end with this, at the end of the event, with 1,000 people on this webinar, Marie Wilson was asked, where do you find hope in this going forward? Like, you know, if we're asking ourselves why we find hope, what if you're an Indigenous person, or in her case, a non-Indigenous person married to an Indigenous man who is the leader in the Northwest Territories and eventually the equivalent of a premier? Her response was amazing. She said, you Christians know that we do this work because it changes us. And we keep at it because we know that we need to be better. We need to be changed. I thought that was really moving. But there was an example of, I mean, I don't think the churches deserve to be there with all of our history and so on and so on, but we needed to push a piece of legislation through. And we were able to engage the justice minister, and we were able to do this and do that and have this huge meeting. And of course, it eventually passed. Now, the question is, what are we doing after that? And how do you keep your focus on issues and so on? I think one of the things we could look at would be, you know, the whole question of synodality and the response of the Canadian Church. It is amazing to think that we would have had a visit to the Pope in Canada. Now I'm speaking of Catholics again, you'll forgive me, with all this emphasis on what we were going to do about Indigenous people, and not one of the chosen delegates to the meetings of the 2 synodal gatherings in Rome was an Indigenous person. Like, how do these disconnects happen is just beyond belief, you know. But to hold up a couple of those kinds of issues, I think are important. I just mentioned 2. Maybe there are others too. I'm sure people could draw our mind to.
I'm really glad you approached it from an issue focus rather than just not mere people, but yeah. Any other suggestions from others? Someone who inspires you today?
All of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners.
Mm-hmm. I even think of some of the, Lois Wilson, United Church, some of Sir Rosella Kenosha-Meg, Indigenous leader in Wikwemekong, or Priscilla, and even Eva Solomon. Again, St. Joseph and their work in Indigenous and ecology, and just to name a few. And there are many others, of course, but Natalie.
There are some pretty cool initiatives around housing in churches and reimagining church properties, both in terms of maybe returning that land to the local First Nations or Métis or Inuit community, or thinking about creating housing, affordable housing or community spaces using church properties. So they do tend to be a more localized expression of that faith and addressing that issue, but many of those groups are also involved in broader advocacy movements that, you know, maybe given the size of those movements and where they originated, they're not associated necessarily with the churches, but the churches are involved there in a way, and I think maybe engaging humbly in a way in the backgrounds that feels appropriate. So so that's an area where there's been some interesting action, I think, and some inspiring creativity.
I'm going to ring Natalie's bell too for, you know, there was, I tell the story sometimes. I've written about this in another little chapter in another book. CPJ surprised me with telling me that I needed to take a sabbatical. I thought they were trying to get rid of me, right? It didn't quite work. I hung around for a while. So we went and we walked the Camino in Spain. We came back, and the first day back at work, two strange things happened. One was I got a call from a woman who was the secretary of the minister, who was going to be in Vancouver, but wanted to call us from Vancouver. He was going to make an announcement. She wouldn't tell me what it was, but we've been working 10 years on trying to get an anti-poverty strategy, right, Natalie, that CPJ worked on. And so we knew it was kind of happening. So that was fine. The next day, we knew when the call was going to come in, and had all the staff sitting around the office and ready for this. Anyway, that was a lovely way to start the morning. The minister said, you know, without the work of the churches, we couldn't have pushed this forward. He also called the general secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, smart politician, right? Thank other people for things that you were able to announce so that your announcement would get noticed. The only problem was, of course, the call came through and I almost dropped the call and said, shit. And then the staff gave me heck because they said, Joe, you don't respond to a minister in that way. So luckily there were other smarter people in the room, and we got the call and he was able to say these nice things, and that was that. But the same day, CBC called me and they said, we need someone to come on and talk on that syndicated program that goes across the country. You're going to do 8 different shows as the time changes in different places, and you're going to answer the question. And the report had just come out of Pennsylvania and the sexual abuse crisis of the church for years and years and years, the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania. And I said, I don't want to do this. Why would I do this? Well, no one else from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops will talk to us, and we understand that you used to work there. And then I thought to myself, this is the last thing I want to do. But if people just refuse to talk about this, how does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. So that first day, we had that wonderful morning of an example of where the churches had moved the yardsticks forward, perhaps working together. And then I was there till 6 o'clock at night doing interviews all the way out from Nova Scotia out to BC, you know, and just going home and feeling a wreck. So some of that's where we're at, you know. John's question about, you know, would anybody listen, and should anybody listen? And for all of our shadow history, can we hold up the times when we've been able to do things? And I guess I think we have to recognize both pieces of this and try and find a way forward through recognizing the institutions and taking structure seriously and highlighting those people that really inspire.
Very good, Joe. I don't know if there's any other questions, but it certainly would be a good note to end on those words, and moving forward and with courage. We didn't use that word a lot this evening, but the courage that it takes to be involved in social activism, especially, including for the bishops and everybody, but everyone. And I forget who Monica was saying, it could be a nasty world out there, and especially when we're talking about issues like this, we're putting our necks out in a lot of ways amongst people who are willing to chop heads, and reputations. So, yeah. Any final questions or observations before we conclude? Well, again, thank you, Joe, for leading us in this conversation. And I hope I'm sure there'll be a lot to think about for us. And so I just want to thank you.